You may be busy doing something while you listen to this podcast, but you're never too busy to eat healthy if you eat Vite Ramen. This podcast is sponsored by Vite Ramen. Show support for a sponsor that supports Moore's Law is Dead at the link in the description. And if you do, make sure you use offer code BROKENSILICON. And you can also support Moore's Law is Dead if you need Windows keys or software at cdkeyoffer.com. If you go there, also use the code BROKENSILICON for 25% off Windows keys or Die Shrink for 3% off everything else on the website. All right, now let's get on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Leap Forward Tom, and I am joined today by my co-host,
Fallback Dan.
Well, I mean, I felt like I fell back today. Every day that, once a year, when we have to turn our clocks forward, just so people know this is recorded on Sunday evenings, I just something happens where I stay up late. And then I lose another hour, and it's just a rough morning.
Yep, I really love the first day of daylight savings time because you just feel groggy all day. It's great. And this isn't a stupid system, and I'm glad we still switch back and forth between daylight and standard time every year.
You know, this is one of those...
A thing that we complain about seemingly every time we have to change the time on this podcast. Probably because we record on Sundays, so we always record on one of the days of the time change.
You know, it's interesting though. I feel like we see a series of clickbait articles every year where they're like, and they're about to change it in Congress or something, and then it just happens again. I don't remember why that is, or if there was a bill that they're just never voting on, or like what's going on with it, or if it's just a complete lie. But here we are yet again doing it, and it is one of those things where I was just Googling while you were talking, like trying to see if there's any poll on like what Americans think of it. But it is interesting. It does seem like there is a chance, depending on the poll, a third of Americans want to keep daylight savings time, or at least a fourth. And I think, first of all, that's insane. But I was expecting to make the point that this is one of those things where I would imagine other countries that don't do daylight savings anymore would go, I don't know, every American hates it, but they won't change it. But apparently there's a third of Americans that might want to keep it.
There are, I guess, a group of people that like it just getting dark too late for half the year for some reason.
Let's move forward here. We have actually a little bit of a shorter script than usual, but it's not. It actually has extra stories, and I know a lot of people are talking about how it's been like a slow news period, and it's definitely slower than it was like 6 months ago, I guess I'd say. But at the same time, I don't know. It feels like we have quite an eclectic set of subjects that are still pretty fun. And would you agree, Dan? This does not feel as boring as it got in like parts of even early or mid, like early 2019 or in 2021. It still feels like we've had way more boring episodes with less news to cover every now and then in the past few years.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing I can see about that I won't have many thoughts on is, as we've discussed to death now, I have very few thoughts on Intel stories at this point, and there is, I think, 1 or 2 Intel stories if I'm remembering correctly. So I don't know well, we usually figure out something to talk about, or we go on a very long digression for every story. So I'm sure that will happen at least once this episode.
Well, I'll save my Intel thoughts for later, but I mean, I will now say it depends. I think there's a chance actually there could be a ton of interesting discussions out of Intel late this year. It's just, it has to be that way. And if I can characterize you how I think you're really thinking about this, you're thinking, I hope it's interesting, but I am done thinking about it in an interesting way until Intel delivers, is basically how you think.
Yeah, that's generally how I feel about them at this point, I would say.
Well, speaking of Intel, God King Jensen Wang writes in and says, if you had the opportunity to send someone to interview Pat Gelsinger in person, why would it be Carbon Cry? Honestly, I'd be worried Carbon Cry would get too angry to interview Pat Gelsinger. And I'm not saying I'm somebody that wouldn't have some really tough questions for him. But, I will say if Moore's Law did get a chance to, which I highly doubt, like I think I might do something where I have like Carbon Cry in like a little earpiece in my ear, helping me stay on subject, because I would just want so many facts prepared by me and then supported by him in the background to keep the conversation on track, because I'm just tired of seeing softball interviews with really basically all CEOs, to be honest, but especially with Pat, where you just see someone interview him for 20 minutes and like no one brings up that half the things they said were going to come out didn't come out. We're just shamelessly playing into their marketing of like 5 nodes in 4 years, which depending on how you count a node, TSMC has already, I think, delivered this. Like, does 6 nanometer count as another node? I mean, what do we get? 5? When did we get to 6? I mean, was it like 2020? Was it 2021, 2022? So there, 5. We have 4 already. I mean, aren't we going to get to like 6 nodes or 5 nodes in that many years with TSMC if we count nodes the way Intel is, when they're really just half steps, if that? I mean, so ask that question. Someone ask him that question, Yeah,
they're just improvements on the same node half the time. But yeah, I guess I don't know Carbon Cry personally. I've never spoken to him, so I don't know how heated he gets in conversation.
I would say that I get the impression, certainly, and you can just looking at his writing, that he would not be throwing any softballs.
No.
No. And there might be some passion behind some of them. All right, let us now get to corrections. This is, of course, where we take in corrections, omissions, and things you and the Patreon think that we missed every news episode. TMC Payton writes in and he says, in Broken Silicon 246, you mentioned that Nvidia has no competitor to Radeon Chill. I can't say Nvidia has a fully comparable feature with the motion-based frame rate limiter, but they do have Whisper Mode since 2017 that appears to accomplish most of what Radeon Chill does. No, I don't agree. You said the motion-based frame limiters. That's the whole point. Like, the point of Radeon Chill is you can both cap your frame rate, but then go a step further and save way extra energy in doing so. And it's useful for much more than just limiting the frame rate. Like, I used it on a mini PC that just had a Rembrandt APU in it that my girlfriend was using for a while. And the extra benefit is when there's not a lot of motion on screen, you can manually tell it to go to something lower. Mm-hmm. And I think I set it to like 45, 48 frames per second or something, like something that was just before, like staying above the FreeSync limit of her minimum of her monitor to keep FreeSync enabled. And in doing so, it made it so that when there's not motion, you're at a lower frame rate. It's always above the FreeSync limit. And then on top of that, because it's only boosting to the max when there's a lot of movement, well, that means that you're hitting peak boost clocks more often than because a simple frame rate limiter at 60 frames per second means that you're still often boosting higher than you really need to. And having that lower limit there means that, especially in like an APU with constrained cooling, you might, when you need the motion, you're keeping it at the peak.
You might you'll limit throttling.
You'll limit throttling, and you won't be throttling as much when you actually need the extra performance. And that saves tons of extra energy, more so than Whisper Mode ever would. And I find it bizarre NVIDIA hasn't done something like that yet, because that plays right into all of their mobility and marketing and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised they haven't. Honestly, it doesn't seem like it should be that hard of a feature to integrate into any graphics lineup, but I don't know.
But so, I don't think that does most of what Radeon Chill does, TMC Pay, and most of what it's doing is that special sauce. We can cap frame rates with MSI Afterburner and a dozen other things. Mm-hmm. Techno writes in and says, not really a correction, more of an additional detail for my could NVIDIA make an APU on 2 nanometer that performs like a 4070 Super on the latest die shrink? By that, I meant, could a switch APU, aka one that uses less than 12 watts, perform like a 4070 Super? With your comparison where you said it easily could, and you brought up Strix Halo, you kind of made it sound like it would be a 30 to 70 watt thing. Right, but that's in docked mode. I think in docked mode an APU could use 30 watts or more. And guys, whenever I'm talking about handhelds and peak performance, I am always talking about docked mode. I think that's something that's emerged a lot, and we'll get to it later in a lot of the comments about the Nintendo Switch leak that I put out, where people are like, well, how could it hit this level of performance at this power consumption? Guys, I'm always talking about docked mode. Always. Because handheld mode is an entirely different can of worms.
Because handheld mode, it needs to be limited to 10 watts, probably?
I mean, from what I've heard, they may go down to the Switch was I think around 9 watts, if I'm remembering correctly. But this time I've heard they may even go to 5 watts because and I don't know what resolution they're using, but if they went with 720p, 5 watts. I mean, I don't think that's a dumb idea to keep it in 720p in the handheld either, because I don't really think people want more than that on a need more than that, I should say, on a 5-inch screen. But you do see the point here, though, that and I want to be clear to Techno here. I don't know what they're going to decide to do with peak TDP and cooling. That's what I would do, though. And you agree, though, it's entirely possible.
Yeah,
though, right. And keep in mind what the question was, too, Techno. Your question wasn't, will Nintendo do that? Your question was, could Nvidia make that? Yes, they could make a docked 2-nanometer chip that is that powerful. I mean, right now, the 4060 Ti is on 4N and has a die size that's smaller than the Xbox Series S. So go 2 nodes. Yeah, you get to 4070 performance. Maybe in docked mode, it's using 50 watts or something. But you didn't ask me if Nintendo will do that. You asked me if Nvidia wanted to make this on 2-nanometer, could they? And the answer is yes. But I don't think Nvidia would make a lot of the decisions Nintendo would.
Oh, well, yeah, because I think Nvidia is probably wanting to push Nintendo to put something more powerful than what Nintendo wants to put in their next system.
All right, let us then move on to the first story here. Story number 1, Nintendo Switch emulator Yuzu folds and pays $2.4 million to Nintendo. Quoting here from The Verge, just over a week ago, Nintendo sued the developers of the leading Nintendo Switch emulator, Yuzu, for facilitating piracy at a colossal scale. Now, it appears that Yuzu will give up without a fight and give Nintendo everything it wanted, and it affects the Nintendo 3DS emulator Citra 2. And quoting here from Hikiko, someone on Twitter, Yuzu devs have turned over all electronic devices, websites, logos, and logs. Yes, that is right, everybody. Logs. Yuzu was apparently running telemetry in the background and collecting anonymous data of all of the people using its emulator. So the most concerning part is how much information Yuzu might have had of their users. Sure, they settled with Nintendo, but they also turned over all of their devices, hard drives, and domains owned by them. And it's no doubt that Nintendo will be digging into these logs that Yuzu kept. And it should be noted that the Yuzu dev sold out its users and fellow developers for their own safety. So ultimately, Yuzu folded because they did make many mistakes, including reportedly sharing pre-release ROMs and even patching Yuzu for the latest Zelda game before it was officially released. But while the Yuzu devs are not heroes, it is a shame that Citra is now dead too. This was the only good 3DS emulator and is now also dead. Well, you cannot currently buy a 3DS hardware new, and the Switch also lacks backwards compatibility to the 3DS as well. So a lot was actually killed here with Nintendo on this one. And it is obvious that Nintendo has lazily chosen to litigate their way away from Switch's crippling obsolescence without addressing many of the reasons Nintendo emulators are so incredibly popular compared to other console emulators in the first place. Today, a smartphone, not even just a PC apparently, Dan. Today, a smartphone can play Switch games faster than the Switch at higher resolutions with a longer battery life than any Switch offers all at the same time. And this includes Tears of the Kingdom, which at a very stuttery 20 frames per second is almost unplayable on the Switch and not playable anywhere else. All right, Dan, so what did you think about this one?
I mean, I don't know. It's bad all around, right? Like, I tend to not recommend emulating things on anything unless it's on a essentially dead platform. But I mean, I do think that's the popularity of something like this speaks to the fact that Nintendo should just release their games on PC anyways, and have dedicated hardware if they want to. But I don't really get why Nintendo is so married to the idea of having dedicated hardware in the first place. I think their games might be more successful if they just became a third-party PC dev.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that. It's just I've only ever really downloaded ROMs or emulators for dead platforms just because there's a lot less to be criticized about downloading quote unquote illegal games when it's on a platform that, well, you can't have access to anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just something that, like, I've heard people say it's always easy to emulate Nintendo software hardware, because it's so much weaker than the competition.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not really always been true. Like, the N64 was like a lot stronger than the PlayStation. And the fact of the matter is, it's just, yeah, but the PlayStation, a lot of those games eventually went onto other platforms. They had backwards compatibility with basically everything until I think the PS4 now. And I think even that has an emulator that can run it. I don't remember if they've enabled it by now. I think the PS4 might be able to run PS1 games, if I'm remembering correctly, which means the PS5 would be able to. And because Nintendo does this, I just think there's people that put way more effort into making Nintendo emulators. And this is a place where Nintendo's like, that's not what we want to do. But it's also like, why? Why don't you want to let us pay you? And so, I don't know. I really have two minds about this. On the one hand, the most depressing thing is seeing that a lot of the best Nintendo emulators just got destroyed. But at the same time, It's like, Carbon Cry writes in here and he says, will you join me in saying fuck Nintendo? It's hard for me to outwardly say that when a company just does what they legally can do to defend their IP. But what I will say is, it is different than a lot of other things that made people mad at console companies in the past. And I'll say something far more damning, which is just to say to Nintendo, you wouldn't have these problems if you let us pay you directly for your games.
Yeah, because Nintendo for me is in a weird place where they don't make enough games that I care about for me to go out and buy their hardware. But I would, if they release their games on Steam, I don't know, there's probably a few games on the Switch, or at least a couple games that are on the Switch that I would have bought. And yeah, I'll agree with you. If they did this for like a Wii or Wii U emulator or something, I would be more pissed at Nintendo for what they did. But the fact of the matter is, Yuzu was essentially distributing their games illegally on PC.
Right. And just to be clear, it's like what they were forced to turn over, as far as I can tell reading this here, hard drives and devices and domains and all the data they had there, but they weren't forced to turn over absolutely everything, like in emails and their Discords, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And so there's this Hikiko person on Twitter seems to be saying they didn't want that, because then they would have proof that they were distributing their ROMs and could have been sued for far, 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 far more money. And who knows what else they could have discovered if they got even more information out of these people, because they were logging telemetry from all of their users, and we don't know what they were logging. Maybe there is other things that they knew they could effectively hide if they settled immediately.
Yeah, because like if this was like I said, the same story about but with, I don't know, Game Boy emulators, I know Nintendo would probably be within their legal rights to go after that if my memory on copyright law still is correct. Because I believe all of those like Pokemon Silver, I believe that would still be under copyright. But it's because they were trying to distribute Tears of the Kingdom when it came out, like immediately when it came out.
Right, and they literally patched the emulator for the game before the game was out.
Yeah. So
they were knowingly using illegal copies of an unreleased game to develop their stuff. And that sort of thing, I think that's what made Nintendo go all out, is they're like, hey, these people are working with people who have hacked copies of our stuff. Like, this could lead to something far worse if they start selling our game before we do.
Yeah, and I it would have been cool if instead of this happening, I don't know, Nintendo did something like, hey, what if instead we acquire your talent and you start porting games to PC. That would be the thing I'd prefer, but that's Nintendo, for one reason or another, doesn't like the idea of putting their games on PC. I don't get it, but that's their choice, I guess.
Yeah. So that's how I feel about it. Is it's like, it just sucks because, I haven't, my backlog of games is so long right now on mostly PC, but also a bit on PlayStation, for me to even consider opening up the Pandora's box of if I tried to go through Nintendo stuff like on emulators or something. So I haven't played a lot of these games. But what I will say is, I mean, it was cool. I remember my girlfriend got sick a year or so ago, and she likes Professor Layden. There's I think I found one on the 3DS and got an emulator going for her. I don't remember if it was this one though. I think it may have been a different one. I don't remember. And at the end of the day, I did that because I had no way I was going to buy it for her on the Switch, but they didn't have it. And I didn't want this one that had lower reviews. And it's just I cannot believe that as much as these emulator people are certainly not heroes, everybody, as we're seeing and what's coming out here.
Yeah.
It is still just but Nintendo, the reason everyone's using them is because you're making it impossible to play your games. I mean, it's very annoying.
Yeah, especially on their older hardware when they don't have backwards compatibility. You're basically just locking your games on. You're locking your games on old hardware that's going to start wearing out over time. And what you're effectively doing is slowly killing the game or people's ability to kill the game. And I know they're a business, so they can be cynical and say, "Well, that's not what we actually care about." But it still sucks.
Mm-hmm. It's funny too. Amiable Chief writes, and this was something you mentioned, says, would being forced to work at Nintendo for the rest of their lives be a more effective punishment for would-be Switch homebrewers and emulation developers? No, I think they would love. I mean, I guess I don't know if these people were refusing to. I doubt Nintendo offered any of this, but I don't know if they want to do that. I do think we have to point out that there is a chance half of the reason they may have been doing this emulator work, the Yuzu stuff. The Yuzu people eventually may have been they were selling people stuff to the dark web or something. We don't know.
Yeah,
it's possible.
Always a possibility.
It is a possibility. So I don't know what type of thing they're interested in. But no, I think a lot of people would love to be what does Sony have? Nixus, who does a lot of the ports. I'm sure a lot of these emulator people would love Nintendo to hire them and do that. They're just not.
Yeah, I mean, if they were hired by Nintendo, like I said, to port their stuff to Windows, I think a lot of them would be excited about that because that would mean Nintendo is no longer being stupid. But
but yeah, so I don't know. I don't think I have much else to say about this one. But let us keep the Nintendo news rolling with story number 2. Moore's Law's Dead leaks new Switch 2 details. After hearing speculation that the Switch 2 SoC design must have changed due to its launching so late issues that's been popping up from, the rumors that might come out in 2025, to me, at a minimum, I mean, to be honest, I expected the Switch to come out by this spring at the latest. That's what I expected, if not this fall. And, on a die shrink, me and you and Dan were talking about how if it doesn't come out this year, is something wrong. Someone at Nvidia actually told me that, to their knowledge, there's nothing wrong with the Switch 2 hardware software. They wanted to tell me that after they heard me talk like that on a die shrink, and that most likely Nintendo is just waiting to sell through their Switch stock. This led to more conversations with additional sources at Nvidia that yielded the following leaked info regarding the Switch 2 in a recent video out of this channel. Number 1, the SoC is mostly based on the Orin platform and has been ready since around late 2022, and that it utilizes, therefore, Samsung 8nm Ampere, but with some Lovelace efficiency tweaks in this custom SoC, because it is custom this time around, and a 128-bit LP DDR5 bus with support for 8, 12, or 16 gigabyte capacities, which were all under consideration last the people I talked to at Nvidia heard. And therefore, the old T239 rumors are still almost entirely correct, it seems. Nvidia presented several options to Nintendo years ago. One of them was a Lovelace design, but it would have used TSMC with less CUDA cores than the Ampere design, so an even smaller node but clocked faster. And Nintendo went for the cost-optimized Orin variant that requires using an old Samsung node, the one without worries for competing for capacity with so many AI projects, which, yes, someone at Nvidia even messaged me after this video came out and said, Yeah, just to be very clear, I am glad that we won't have to worry about Nintendo's new console competing with Hopper allocation.
No, that's
But
fair.
I mean, and I think that's half of the reason that Nintendo went with this was not just cost, which is wildly cheaper per wafer compared to even like a 6 nanometer at TSMC, but also because they know that they will be able to spit these things out without everyone competing with them for all of these other chips. Also, though, in this leak, I said that AMD bid hard against Nvidia for the Switch 2 contract and almost won it over Nvidia, but allegedly barely lost the bid due to their lower GPU performance around 5 watts, or at a minimum, performance that didn't really impress compared to Nvidia and required using a more expensive TSMC node. And so there you go. Performance is expected to be between the Steam Deck and Xbox Series S, and Nintendo seems to be being Nintendo again regarding most of the specs, which is very unsurprising. Although it must be noted that this APU does have, at least in my opinion, more GPU performance for its time compared to the original Switch did when it launched in 2017. The Switch had a GPU close to the then 1-year-old GTX 920MX, which was later rebranded in that year, I believe, to the MX 110. So think of it that way. The Switch 1 had an MX 110. The Switch 2 is going to use something comparable to if NVIDIA ever launched an MX 560, or I guess in 2025, maybe it would be rebranded to something called like a 640. So it is older tech near the bottom of their lineup, but it's not literally the bottom anymore like 10 would denote it was. It's something between a 40 and a 60 in the MX series. So it's a bit better for its time. And it is optimized around GPU performance with an existing tool set focusing heavily on FP16 utilization, which a lot of people forget the Switch actually performs a little better than you would expect for its teraflops because of that at the time. And it will also should get a decent boost from DLSS in many of its games. And so the real performance should be competitive against contemporary PC handhelds. I think this will be a bit better let me think about where the teraflops will be. I think even in handheld mode, it should be around as Steam Deck, maybe slightly better. And in docked mode, maybe it will get close to feeling like you're gaming on a Xbox Series S, but of course with probably lower frame rates because its CPU is a lot weaker. Let me see here. The final thing that should be noted is that this generation, Nintendo will have a lot more competition than before, with dozens of gaming handhelds in the market right now, a successful Steam Deck, and Sony potentially making a new PlayStation handheld. None of that was competition for the original Switch. And so it isn't actually that surprising that Nintendo would take it a bit more seriously this time. Although I will say 12 gigabytes, which is what I'm hearing they'll probably go with, is going to be necessary for this thing to age like I'm saying it could, which is a bit better than the original Switch. If they go with 8 gigabytes, I honestly think it'll just be like the original Switch, where they have a few AAA games that release from third parties. Then over time, they just give up trying to port games to it. All right. So what did you think, Dan?
I mean, I would say not surprising, but slightly disappointing with the Switch 2, because I was hoping it would be based on Lovelace, although Nintendo doesn't care about being up to date on hardware, so going with Lovelace makes sense. It's just, I don't know.
I mean, going with Ampere.
Yeah, sorry, going with Ampere makes sense for the way their design philosophy works, which is just buy stuff that's cheap. But it's just, I don't know. I don't think it's going to really compete with any of the new PC handhelds. So I without being competitive with those, or without being super competitive with those handhelds, I'm curious how well the Switch 2 will perform, given that the market landscape is completely different than what it was when a Switch released. Because it had been like 5 years since a decent handheld had come out.
Yeah, so I mean, Vita was gone there, and I looked it up. The only gaming handheld was, I think, the original GPD that used, I believe, a Cherry Trail Atom, and that was before Atom was anything. I mean, it's not great now, but this was well before their small cores. Their little cores got a little bit better. We're talking about integrated graphics that were just god awful. Like, it had 256 Maxwell CUDA cores that did actually beat like a lot, like the only other handheld I can think of at the time.
But the market just in 2017, I think, was starved for a handheld device, and
which is why that GPD startup emerged and did decently well.
And now there's just so many freaking handhelds out there right now. I'm just curious if a lot of people, or what number of people, I should say, will decide, well, I'm happy with my Steam Deck or whatever offshoot of the Steam Deck they have they own. It's like, I'm curious just how much overlap in the market there is between people that are interested in having a Switch and interested in having a Linux/PC handheld.
Well, and here's the thing, too. It's funny when we talk about performance. I mean, first thing I will say is I actually don't think it's going to seem weak when it comes out. If they go with the top version of the specs. Again, if we find out they're disabling it, they're not clocking it to even 1 gigahertz, it has 8 gigabytes of RAM, then it's like, well, yeah, I don't know. Then I guess it is weaker than the Steam Deck. But, I think it sounds like there's a chance this could be something a bit better. And I don't see anything else on the horizon, Dan, that really sounds like it's going to beat it, actually, until late next year. Because what's better? I mean, we've seen tests of a lot of these, like the ROG Ally, and the ROG Ally can't beat the Steam Deck despite having a wildly stronger APU theoretically. Yes, if you plug it in and chug 50 watts, which again, Techno, there's a handheld that's using 50 watts without even being docked. But I don't even like that's what it takes to beat the Steam Deck. I don't think anyone really wants it. So something that is actually decently portable and isn't shooting out a furnace into your hand and apparently breaking the SD card reader like the ROG Ally did with its heat. I don't actually see a direct competitor until Strix handhelds come out. And even then I'll be Kraken, really. So I actually think, but that's what makes it also a little more odd that they're not launching sooner to me, is it's like by the time you launch this, no, there might be things way better. But again, I think a lot of those handhelds will cost $1,000 or at least $700. So I think its niche is pretty safe. I just don't think it's like they can go full stupid mode this time because it is contested.
I mean, the thing is, though, so it's based off of what at this point? Ampere is 3-year-old tech at this point. So that's outdated, and they're
right, but it has 12 SMs. That's 50% more SM/CUs than the Steam Deck has. It's a decent size GPU. That's all I'm saying.
I know, but if you want it in handheld mode, I mean, you're going to have to be limited to the same. You're going to have the same power constraints that the Steam Deck does, and it's
not necessarily. It has the power gating of Lovelace, which allows it to go down to higher clocks and use less power than expected. So 5 watts. For this is not like a 5-watt Ampere card because it does have those Lovelace tweaks. Is it as efficient as RDNA 4 or 3.5? No, probably not. But I think it's too soon to rule out. I think the way to think about it is they're using an outdated node, not entirely outdated tech, and they also have a weak CPU. I don't think all of it's going to be as outdated as people think. Like it might have an IP block for streaming and SSDs like the PS5. This is not like
I would hope it does. And
PC doesn't, so.
And I would hope that it has at least 12 gigs of RAM because 8 gigs is going to be an issue if they want it to be a semi-open platform and not a walled garden like the Switch is.
Right, but again, when you say outdated tech, well, is the Steam Deck outdated? It doesn't have SSD streaming, so.
Well, yeah, but the Steam Deck is outdated and it's 2 years old. That's kind of my point. Is it's based off of similar tech that existed at the time the Steam Deck was created, and it's just coming out years later. So maybe it won't seem weak when it comes out, but it's going to seem very weak once people start putting Strix into a handheld.
And I 100% agree with that. That's something that I just want to be clear. See, I agree with that. I think, and that's where the 12 gigabytes of RAM thing comes in. I think they have something that's strong enough to hit the performance they want to get to. It's just they better make it so it can keep doing that the whole generation because it is not like last gen. I think they'll have a year. I think next year they're going to have a time period where people actually think it's kind of impressive. It's just the only way they keep that going is if they don't cheap out on RAM. And so if I see 8 gigabytes, I'm just going to go, all right, and I want to be clear. I think it's so interesting. The specs that I talked about seemed like a Rorschach test for what people think about Nintendo, which I'm just in the middle. I think people who really like hating on Nintendo saw those specs and they went, there's no way it's going to be half that performance. And it's like, this isn't that impressive, you guys. I don't think they can. I mean, no, I don't.
It can't be that much weaker than that.
I don't think you guys comprehend how weak that would be. It would be worse than the Switch was, and then there would be the other people that, probably overestimate, I don't know, maybe rose-tinted glasses on their opinions of Nintendo, and they just go, oh, so this is easily going to crush an Xbox Series S. And I go, no, that is not what I think. I think they have something that will work for them that's in the middle of those two outcomes here. But it's very clear they didn't completely cheap out this time. It's also very clear that they are not planning to win. Like, they're not taking it as seriously as you would think Sony would take it if they were trying to defend this space. Mm-hmm. Right. Essie is ready for spring. She's excited to get outside and start carrying around entire tree branches that she just thinks are S-tier sticks, which really, they can't be that healthy for her, although I can't imagine they're really any more unhealthy than the typical ramen people are eating on a busy workday. Well, of course that is, unless they eat Vite Ramen. This piece of content is brought to you by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a healthy, tasty, and shelf-stable food crafted by an American startup that offers tons of options for eating healthy, like their classic packages that make it easy to add protein and other ingredients of your choice, or also their Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy, microwavable option for those who truly only have a 15-minute lunch break when they are away from home. And I also need to take a second to promote their Nano Boost Vitality Powder as well. Seriously, this is a fantastic alternative to coffee that you'll find me drinking in many Broken Silicon episodes when I'm forced to record late at night, and I truly do believe it blows away their competition. You have to understand, I've been working with the people at Vite for years now, and I have a lot of freedom in what I can promote from their website. And out of the things they make, I have to say, it blows away the competition. This thing tastes great. It's easy to mix into water. You never has that sand-like texture their competitors often have. And so I really cannot recommend that enough, in addition to just basically everything on their website. Going to their website and buying something from Vite Ramen, that directly supports this channel, and it supports a sponsor that's been good to the Moore's Law's Dead team for many years. So I really do like their products, all of them, especially their ramen and Nano Boost Vitality Powder, and I can't recommend them enough. So support Moore's Law's Dead by supporting Vite today. Let me get this question here. Hayubu writes in and says, when discussing Nintendo wanting the Switch 2 to get third-party game support akin to other game consoles as a critical selling point and strategy, well, I want to be clear about this. I never said that. What I said is Nintendo wants us to be able to output their games to a 4K TV and have it look good. They never said, we're sure we want, I don't know, the next Call of Duty to be able to launch day and date on it. I would if I worked at Nintendo. There's 130 million people that can now buy Call of Duty on your console. Why would you not want to take a cut of those profits? But it's more about they wanted to get it to a certain level of performance, not they want it to be able to do what I think it should be able to do. But continuing when he says, because the Xbox Series S seems to be often spoken in the same sentence by you for discussing performance. Do you think Nintendo making the Series S at this performance level ended up helping Nintendo take this opening? Can both companies benefit from this? No. Well, it is interesting, actually. I think the Series S helps Nintendo more than the Switch 2 helps Microsoft, which I want to be very clear about this. There's been some people completely misunderstanding what I've said about the Series S. I said in the ballpark of that graphical performance, not as good or stronger in all ways. CPU is definitely weaker. And I also think people are missing how weak the Series S is. Like, what is it? I think I saw Kepler on Twitter go, that's 20 RDNA 2 compute units. And I'm like, yeah, running at half the clock speed of every other APU you can get right now out of AMD. The Series S runs at low clock speeds. It's only 4 baby teraflops, and they're 4 teraflops with a split 10 gigabyte memory system that I looked it up. The RTX 2050 seems to outperform the Series S and Assassin's Creed Valhalla. that was a launch game running 720p 60 from 2020. So when I compare this to a Series S, number one, I say ballpark, not equal in all ways. The Series S will definitely just be better at some things. And number two, that is not a compliment. The Series S sucks, guys. Like the Series S is weaker than a 6500 XT and an RTX 2050. And you guys all hate those cards. So
I could see the fact that that Microsoft is forcing this level of performance to still be relevant. It could be beneficial to Nintendo, though. But I will say it. I think Microsoft is forcing it to be relevant because the Series S just happens to be the most successful console Microsoft is currently selling.
Right.
Which is weird and unfortunate to me. But
if we consider that, I think the estimate I've seen is 80% of Xbox Series sales is like Series S, something like that, everybody. And like they think they've sold like 30 to 50 million consoles. So it's like, I don't know what number you give that, but that's 35, 40 million Series S's that are out there, 30 to 40 million, let's say. Okay. There's 130 million Switches that have been sold.
Yeah.
So I want to be clear. Has this made it easier for Nintendo to have more relevant AAA games at launch? Probably. But I have to say this. I don't think it goes both ways. If the Switch 2 gets 12 gigabytes of RAM, I think that might make the Series S age even worse faster. Because everyone, all these developers are going to go, dude, this Xbox doesn't sell a third the consoles of Nintendo. And now Nintendo has more RAM than the Series S. I don't know. Some games might age better on Nintendo. This might be like devs going to Microsoft. Dude, even weak ass Nintendo has more RAM than your console, dude. We're not going to put that much effort into optimizing this anymore. Especially if it became a hit where people actually started buying things like Call of Duty on it. Not saying it will. Like if that happened to the Switch, I just could see so many devs go, yeah, I don't know. It actually runs at a higher resolution on the Switch because we didn't want to mess around with the RAM that much. And all we did is crank down the resolution on the Series S to like 640p, but it runs at a higher frame rate than the Switch. So, you see what I'm saying? I think it helps the Switch. I don't know that it helps the Series S that the Switch, if it has 12 gigabytes, I think it would actually hurt the Series S.
Well, yeah, I mean, the only way I could see the Nintendo helping the Series S is if they started a contractual agreement with them and started not exclusively, but started selling Nintendo games on the Switch or on Xbox or something like that. Maybe that would make it pick up sales, but
yeah. Okay, so Deadeyes117 writes in. It says, obviously, the Switch 2 will output a 4K signal when docked. However, Digital Foundry showed that on their rough approximation of Switch 2 hardware with DLSS up to full 4K, so they took an RTX 2050, Dan, and they clocked it at 775 megahertz to try to account for the CUDA core count difference. And he says, to full 4K, it got a huge performance hit when it was using DLSS due to how weak its tensor performance is. It was actually interesting, by the way. What I think a lot of people are not accounting for is the likelihood that only smart upscale to something like 1440p is what they're going to do, then use a traditional upscaler to meet the 4K output for modern TVs, right? Because I think what they found, they found that it actually lacked the 2050. Seemed to be at really low clock speed. There seemed to be a bottleneck in tensor performance, where going up for more, like at 4K itself, it just didn't have the chops. And he's saying, I think like a lot of people have apparently, I haven't seen this, but apparently he's saying some people have said, well, that means that this can't be the correct specs. And just to answer your question here, Deadeyes. So first of all, this is not Orin. This is a custom SoC. So I'm sure whatever Nintendo did with Nvidia, they probably thought about that. And the second thing is, what I'm hearing from the Nvidia people I talk to is they expect DLSS to be used in most games. So I will say this: I did not hear that there's maybe there will be, but I did not hear there's like a mandate to use DLSS. But I did hear they expect it to be used in most games. So I'm assuming this problem is worked around. But in addition to that, in that same Digital Foundry video, Deadeyes, they talk about the fact that Orin has this AI acceleration chip in it that their desktop cards don't have. Like, I think a lot of people keep forgetting that these mobile, basically self-driving chips NVIDIA's made and stuff, like these things are not the same specs as Ampere or Maxwell before. Like, for example, Maxwell in the original Switch has FP16 performance that's twice as good as desktop Maxwell. So it would stand to reason that if there is this AI accelerator, which apparently there is in Orin, and that it accelerates tensor performance, yeah, I bet they kept that, and the RTX 2050 doesn't have that. They literally addressed this in the video.
Well, yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen how comparable existing hardware is for gaming to what the Switch 2 will be. And I'm sure Nintendo is considering that when they're in their design choices for the Switch. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the base resolution for most Switch 2 games is really low, like 720p, 1080p,
which is apparently ultra performance mode for 4K uses a base resolution of 720p.
So maybe they'll have DLSS that's not ultra performance, but performance mode, and the DLSS on a lot of it will be 1440p or something like that.
And then they just have an upscaler help them. Or again, or it has an AI accelerator chip or IP block. Maybe they'll use that.
Or maybe it will have a better upscaler than what Lovelace had. That's also completely.
Or it just works differently. Like they don't brute force it with tensor cores. What they do is they have this other thing that accelerates it just for this one usage. So it's not something I'd really worry about too much. I mean, there's multiple. I mean, like, let me look this up too. RTX 2050. Let me look at the specs on this. Like, depending on the speed of DDR5 used, LP DDR5 used. Yeah. So, I mean, you guys also got to remember that the RTX 2050 has a 64-bit 4GB buffer. This will have unified memory. It'll be programmed more to the metal. And a lot of the optimization issues on PC pop up more and more the less VRAM you have, because that's half of the benefit of console devs is they're making sure there aren't VRAM issues. And so, again, I just want to remember that approximation Digital Foundry did, that was an interesting finding they found. But to assume that proves that literally entirely different hardware that in some metrics is similar, but in other specs is entirely different than a 2050, that it would all pan out the same. Dr. Deep writes in and says, what can we expect software-wise from the Switch 2? We'll use the same accounts. Can we expect backwards compatibility with upscaling? I'd really love it if we could play better versions of our existing libraries, but knowing Nintendo, they will probably double dip on those. Well, so, and this is where I just wanted to use this reader mail to say, I never claim to have a source at Nintendo, people. You know, I speak to some developers. I can tell you, based on speaking to some developers when the dev kits came out, I believe like a year ago or something. Like, so this thing's been done for a while, but I can tell you some of the specs from talking to people at Nvidia. I have not talked to someone at Nintendo for this particular leak that touched on Nintendo stuff. And so all I can tell you is what's possible. That goes the same for the 8GB thing versus 12GB versus even 16GB, I guess. That also goes for how good backwards compatibility and upscaling will be. I will tell you this, though, with I think over $130 million person install base for the original Switch, I think it would be bonkers if Nintendo didn't have backwards compatibility to that user base and didn't advertise, hey, by the way, we have patches coming out that force DLSS in some of our older games. And now now with the stronger CPU and using DLSS, or just maybe even running it at a higher resolution, now we have, the latest Zelda game running at a locked 30 or 60 on 4K screens with DLSS. Like, that would be crazy if they didn't have backwards compatibility and then didn't use that as a chance to market. Like day one, that Animal Crossing game you bought on the eShop, guess what? Now it runs at 4K 60 on your TV. So I can't promise you they'll do that, but Nintendo loves to make weird blunders with hardware and software, but that would be something that would, I think, make it feel like they're keeping the momentum going. Like, they had the Switch OLED for like $350. Then they're like, yep, now it's $400 and it runs all those games you already bought way, way better. Just get this instead. We've stopped production on the old Switch. That seems like common sense to me.
Yeah, and if the old Switch is there, I mean, if they're waiting to release this to sell through the remaining stock of the original Switch, that would only make sense if they were trying to make it a continuous line more than two separate consoles. So if they're having a clean break in production between the Switch and the Switch 2, the that only makes sense to me if they're going to have backwards compatibility.
Mhm.
Because like with the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, I mean, they basically stopped selling the PS4 when the PS5 came out because the PS5 is a PS4 basically.
Yeah. God King Jensen Wang writes in, and he says, given Nintendo's 2024 fiscal year ends in March 2024, is it possible that the Switch being 2025 simply means Nintendo's 2025? I'm doubtful, but hey, gotta cope, am I right? I think I saw some people suggesting that too as an interesting like conspiracy theory. Ooh, it really means what I will say is I never claimed to know for sure the day it's coming out. So all I can tell you is that from Nvidia's perspective, this thing's been done. So if they wanted to launch it this year, they probably could. What I would say is this, though, if we don't see like an announcement by June or something, or at least firm rumors that they're going to announce it, then maybe with like a picture of it, like they're going to have to start manufacturing this within a few months to launch it this year. So I mean, if we don't see that, then no, I don't think it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I also like if your sources are outside of Nintendo and you're saying in what you hear is 2025, it would be very.
I haven't heard someone say 2025. I just know other people have been alleging that.
Okay, I don't know if these sources are real though that are saying 2025. Not being able to communicate whether they mean a financial year or the actual year doesn't make sense to me.
I agree, because I don't think they were talking in financial years. I think they would say they just saw a presentation that said this is when we plan to launch. Techno writes in and he says, if the developers can't or don't make games for Switch 2, will they rush back to Nvidia and choose the ADA option? No, it's done. They are going with 8 nanometer Samsung. And since putting out that video and that live stream, I've only heard more and more people chime in and go, it's on 8 nanometer. Those specs are all correct. And I will say this, Techno, the developers I've spoken to, including one that hasn't been on the show yet that might come on this summer, that I'm talking to behind the scenes, they're all excited. They all think it's better. Talk to Brian Heemskirk. He has concerns about the CPU for sure. He is much more excited about this than the original Switch. And like I said, another developer I spoke to seemed to think that this is more than what they need. So Techno, this is enough for them. And again, I think people like fundamentally misunderstand. I said this in the live stream. I'm going to say it again here. Like how Nintendo looks at performance. It's not, yes, they cheap out, but the way they're cheaping out isn't, let's be stupid. Maybe it was for the Wii U. That was the most perplexingly customized console, one of the most I've ever seen. But what they do is they say, we want to hit this level of performance and do these things. Once we get there, we're done. And the problem is I disagree with them on where it should be. Right. I think if the Switch 1 had a little more compute performance and 6 gigabytes of RAM, they could have confidently ran probably almost all PS4 games at 30 frames at low res. And that little bit of difference would have been able to have all these other games that they could have taken a cut out of. But I don't think they just said, let's see how dumb. And they didn't go, what's the cheapest we could do? Technically, they could have made it weaker, actually. And so I think what you got to think about is Nintendo looked at the Switch 2 and said, what's the minimum RAM? What's the minimum performance that we can just barely get like 4K 30 or like running with aggressive DLSS for our first party games and have AAA games still run at least 30 frames, sometimes maybe 40 with, VRR, and get there with AAA. And I think the minimum is 12 gigabytes personally, and is performance at least within the ballpark of a Series S. So you do that, you're running all AAA games, probably at lower frame rates in a lot of them because the CPU is so weak. But I've heard that the CPU performance is overall, the best way to put multi-threading performance can be comparable to the Switch, the Steam Deck, but not single threading, meaning it can probably run the same engine, but it won't get to 60. It'll probably be at 30. So I think that's what you got to think about. And all developers seem to say, Techno, this is enough to probably do that at 30 frames, which is probably all Nintendo wanted.
Yeah, because I don't think Nintendo is ever going to try to make a 1440p 120 hertz console. So
right. But I think this is a distinction because I do not believe the original Switch correctly got to what. Well, I don't know if they actually wanted to run all AAA games actually on the original Switch.
But they clearly didn't because It's not
Yeah.
like they're trying to get that. They made a big deal about getting The Witcher to hobble
A
on it,
2016 or something game, right? Or
yeah,
older? I don't remember. A very old. I think it was before that. Now I have to look because I don't want the comments to get mad at me. Let's see. Witcher 3 release date. It came out 2015. So this is a game that was barely, like barely a mid-gen PS4 game. This was not like the latest game that they got running on it, and it barely did. So the problem, again, it wasn't that they cheaped out. It was just they didn't get the specs to make devs go, okay, we can do that. And at launch, there were devs going 4 gigabytes isn't enough. This generation, if it has 12 gigabytes, they've all said that's just barely where we need it to be. There will probably be a few games where the CPU is too weak, but I think most will be able to make do. Bullethead writes in, and he says, "Hey, Tom, what do you think about Shawn Layden's recent statements in an interview? He said, single player games, day and date on multi-platforms, it's just juiced isn't worth the squeeze. And when your costs for a game exceed $200 million, exclusivity is your Achilles heel to be able to profit. Well, the games industry definitely needs more people banging the drums about its problems. Are some of his ideas just short-term band-aids for long-term problems?" I don't know all of his ideas, but I think, I talked about with Vex in depth and a lot on the recent loose ends that we need more AA, more indie. And, when you say something like when the cost for a game exceed $200 million, exclusivity is an Achilles heel. Right. So Sony, if they're going to make exclusives, they need more AA exclusives to promote their console. Right. That's what they should be doing. And then if they launch one game that's AAA first, eventually bring it to PC, that's fine if you eventually do that, but you have that exclusivity window. But I think this goes to show that it makes so much sense to have more AA games for so many reasons, whether they're exclusive or not. It's like, look at Helldivers is the first successful big multiplayer game Sony's had for a long time, and it was not made by a AAA studio. More indie, more AA. This plays into benefits for so many different strategies. We need more of this, less AAA.
Well, yeah, I think most of Sony's studios need to do, like what Naughty Dog was doing back in the PS3 and PS4 days, before they reconsolidated their teams, having 2 or 3 dev teams that are working all independently. So, like, you have these studios that are functionally working as multiple studios. That needs to be the philosophy more often than the philosophy of getting like 400 to 900 people working on a single game for 7 years. Studios need to be making more smaller games that don't take 8 years to freaking make.
Well, and this is something that I've heard actually recently talking to people too, which is kind of common sense, but I'll just say, not only am I saying this, I think this, but I've heard people say this directly. There's only so much you can scale up. And you're eventually going to have someone at the top. Eventually, that person's going to have 4 lieutenants, if you will, giving orders to different teams on the dev team. And eventually, you can't do it. And so, from that perspective, once you're scaling up to a 900-person dev team, I have to ask, what are they doing? Because there's only so many roles you can do with multiple people, and they're adding a bunch of side missions we don't need. Like, that is my opinion. Like, have a smaller dev team, have a few side missions in every area, not 100. Cut it, sell it now, and get it, and then start working on the sequel. Like, come on.
Well, yeah, because like as much as I love the game, The Last of Us 2, like 10 out of 10 game for me, but it is 2 games. It's literally just 2 games.
We were talking about that recently with our friend who just beat it for the first time, and it's like, yeah, I think, even as someone who really likes that game, you could have cut the Ellie section down by 10% and the Abby section down by 20%. You really could have.
Yeah, probably.
And that would have been better. And then you wouldn't, and then also not waste time on trying to make a faction spinoff that went nowhere. And who knows, maybe they could have just had an entirely new $40 spinoff game done by now if they weren't wasting their time on all these extra ideas.
Yep, and I really, given the fact that it was canceled, I really wish Factions would have just been a true successor to what it was in the first game, where it's just a semi-tacked on thing. And it's like, yeah, the gameplay is really fun, play it multiplayer in these maps that already exist, rather than trying to make an entire new Factions. Like, live service game set in San Francisco.
And then again, meanwhile, Helldivers comes with a fraction of the budget, actually launches, makes tons of money.
Yep.
Or AA people. And by the way, if you're keeping track with the drinking game, take a shot now. We mentioned factions in another episode in a row. All right, let us now move on to story number 3. All Jessie wants is for Maurice to play with her more often. But unfortunately, he just does not give out playtime or kisses for as low of a rate as she does. And I think she's just going to have to deal with that. But do you know what you don't have to deal with? Paying too much for Microsoft software if you go to cdkeyoffer.com. This piece of content is sponsored by cdkeyoffer.com. Whether it's Microsoft operating systems, Office products, or even many of the latest games, cdkeyoffer.com provides PC gamers with a product this community deserves. Amongst endlessly elevating component costs, fair pricing on Microsoft keys is one thing that we at least should get, I think. And you know, the Moore's Law is Dead team has been working with cdkeyoffer.com for a very long time. And that's because they're good to me, good to Dan, good to about a dozen family members of friends of mine that have used their services. And they've been really, really good, most importantly, to the Moore's Law is Dead community. So support this channel by using offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% off Microsoft software, or you can also use Die Shrink to save 3% off everything else on the website like games. Using either of those codes really helps the channel a ton, and it helps save you money. So use those codes BrokenSilicon and Die Shrink at cdkeyoffer.com today. GDDR7 is officially a JEDEC standard, and just like Moore's Law is Dead leaked years ago, we should not expect higher density amounts that early. So from AnandTech here, JEDEC on Tuesday published the official specifications for GDDR7 memory, the latest iteration of the long-standing memory standard for graphics cards and other GPU-powered devices. The newest generation of GDDR brings a combination of memory capacity and memory bandwidth gains, with the latter being driven primarily by the switch to PAM3 signaling on the memory bus. The latest graphics RAM standard also boosts the number of channels per DRAM chip as you interface training patterns and brings in on-die ECC to maintain the effective reliability of the memory. There will be 32 gigabit per second speeds at launch, which for those keeping track is, well, I said keeping track, so why don't I actually keep track? For those keeping track, is 33% faster than the fastest GDDR6X on the market right now. And theoretically, they are planning for potentially trying to get to 48 gigabit per second speeds eventually, which would double not just GDDR6, but GDDR6X speeds. Getting, again, meaning a 256-bit graphics card in a few years may have more bandwidth than a 4090 overclocked even. So also, at launch, there will be 16 gigabit density chips, and eventually they're hoping to get to 64 gigabit chips. Now, here's something that's interesting, though. At launch, their capacity limit per chip is the same as where GDDR6X is right now. And GDDR6 standard was supposed to get to, I believe, 32 gigabit density. It never did.
Wait, so 32 gigabyte density or
gigabit per one of those chips.
Okay.
Meaning it adds up if you have a 256 plus, you know. So I think that's worth pointing out. GDDR6 people has never gotten to the memory capacities they were hoping to get to. And at launch, GDDR7 is not going to offer a capacity increase, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And because GDDR6 never got to their theoretical what numbers they were hoping to get to, I don't know that we should assume GDDR7 is going to do more than double density. I don't know that it will quadruple. It could, but you know, that's only if it gets to the theoretical numbers they're hoping for, and 6 never did. But anyways, so yeah, GDDR7 is a largely expected step in memory that will be coming just in time for Blackwell's performance. And it is notable that it uses PAM3, not PAM4 like GDDR6X did. This is possibly a trade-off for efficiency and board costs, as G7 has to scale from low-end devices to the top, while GDDR6X is only for high-end and leaves the door open also, I would argue, for a PAM4 version of this to happen again. It could be GDDR7X. So that will probably exist too out of Micron, if I had to guess. Oh, and yeah, if you're disappointed by the limited capacity, perhaps the internal organization of DRAM makes it easier for G7 to get higher per chip capacity. Remember that the G6, yeah. So that's just so the rest of the write-up's going into what I already interjected. So again, just like I leaked years ago, unfortunately, it does not seem like there will be that 1.5 capacity thing happening, which I think would be 24 gigabit, which would have meant 12 gigabytes over a 128-bit bus, and not even 16. I guess that's just not going to be ready for another year, at least, I think.
I mean, I guess I could see that turning Blackwell at the low end could make that somewhat disappointing, but yeah, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are all on this, but to me, this reads that, I don't know, maybe they're starting to run into some limitations if they're having trouble pushing specs past, even really that much past what GDDR6 was.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I was talking to someone at Nvidia about this, I guess at this point over a year ago, the person told me that they were surprised they weren't going to announce it and disappointed. So people at Nvidia were at least expecting this. And that was part of that video I put out a while ago, was just like, yeah, they went with 128-bit for the 4060 Ti so that they could fit something that is the 106 die into 128-bit motherboards on laptops. But they were hoping 12 gigabytes would have been an option, and it just wasn't. And that kind of blindsided them a little bit. You could still say they should have used a higher, bus capacity, which I think they pretty much agree with everybody, by the way, that they should have for the 106 die and maybe even the 104 die. But it is blindsided them a little bit, and they aren't happy about it. So is there some limitation there? Yes, maybe. But at least from what NVIDIA was told, I don't know. A lot of these companies were like, we just don't know that as many customers care about this that much yet or something. And they're like, you don't? Really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe it won't be an issue by the time whatever comes out after Blackwell and RDNA 5. But it does seem to me that this could make the next generation of cards a little bit uninteresting, though.
We'll see. I mean, I think, they can still clamshell stuff. I guess this gets to an interesting conversation, though, that I did want to at least touch on. Do you think, and again, I haven't tried to even put together the full Blackwell leak really yet here. All I know is rough performance, which is going to be there. The performance will be there. It is. They're going to use 3 nanometer for at least the top gaming card. All this has been leaked by the channel already. But I got to say, do you think 24 gigabytes would cut it for being called a 5090? Because my argument is,
I mean, I hope
they could they get away with it? Yes, I think they could. I would be critical of this, though.
I would hope that the 5090 at least gets to 32 gigabytes, but I don't know. With this, I don't know what that would mean, because if I'm reading it correctly, wouldn't it mean the option would be, I mean, they kind of has to be 24 gigabytes or maybe 48 gigabytes, but.
Well, if there's a 512-bit bus or even 448, well, that's how you can get to something like, 32, between 26 and 32 gigabytes, depending on how much it was disabled. So there's that option that's worth pointing out. But another thing I might suggest is, I don't know, Dan. I mean, what if they use clamshell memory and they give it like a 320-bit bus? They disable the top card because AMD is not competing, and they give it, or what would that be, 40 gigabytes?
Would 320 be, that would be 40 gigabytes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that'd be if they clamshelled it.
I mean, that certainly wouldn't be a disappointment in my mind.
Well, and what if what they do is they launch a 5090 that has a disabled bus, so somewhere between 32 and 40 gigabytes, depending on how much they disable it. And then once the higher capacity comes around, that's when they launch a 5090 Ti. The question will just become how much bandwidth do they need? But, if 32 gigabytes. So wait, let's do the math right here, baby. Let's see. 32 divided by, I think right now they're using like 22 or something gigabit per second. Let's just do that. Okay, so that's 45% more. And let me multiply that by 32. 320 divided by 384. Right. So they would still get to at least 20% more bandwidth if they did that alone. And so I don't know. I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but you could see some wiggle room here where depending on the cache they have on hand, or if there is even faster, like could they get it so that it's just fast enough to be 50% faster than a 4090 with a 320-bit bus, and then they just save all of the best yields? Like they cut this down. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, because thinking about that, if it's only 20% faster than what they have right now, I'd be a bit worried that.
Well, I think it would be more than that, but okay. I think I'm suspecting they would need more than 20% more bandwidth to hit 50% more performance than a 4090.
Yeah, well, because if it was only that much more, I think the 5090 would be really, really bandwidth starved. But
yeah, so just thinking about it, I guess we'll see. The thing is, I think they can get away with 24 gigabytes one more gen, but I will be critical of that. And I think just psychologically, if you want people to pay $2,500 for this card, which I think they'll probably want people to be willing to, that you might want 32 gigabytes, I think would make the E-Peen people buy it.
Yeah.
Like I do. Whereas 24 gigabytes, a lot of people might go, I don't know. But so I don't know. It's interesting. I'm almost walking myself into begrudgingly saying I might have 24 gigabytes. We'll see. Techno writes in and says, will GDDR7W be the HBM replacement on consumer GPUs? He says, so in other words, like 768-bit. I think it's like kind of like a stacked GDDR thing that Samsung's did with GDDR6W that they showed off and won as a Samsung as half a PowerPoint company. But anyways, just to answer this question, Techno, it doesn't exist. Like Samsung announces all of these special RAM types near the end of the GDDR6 life cycle so that they can argue they're ahead of Micron still. At least talking to people like Daniel Nenny and actually people at Nvidia as well, they're all like, dude, Samsung's, whatever the top thing Samsung's talked about they're making, they're not making it.
It's a PowerPoint product.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say no. And I don't think there is an HBM replacement. Like HBM went down in price between 1 and 2 per gigabyte, but then has skyrocketed since then, I've heard. So no, I don't think they're going to be using HBM for any of this stuff. I think they'll go to GDDR7X with the generation, or maybe the generation after Blackwell. But I don't think there's really an HBM replacement coming to GPUs anytime soon, especially not during an AI boom. Where they all use HBM. I don't think so. I think we're just going to have to accept that GDDR7 at least doubles bandwidth over 6x, and that should be enough for now. Carbon Cry writes in, and he says, given how many people seem oblivious to the shitty low quality LOD textures when using GPUs with totally okay RAM amounts like 8 or 6 gigabytes, do you think that I like mud nostalgia for 360 and PS3 era has now overtaken the CRT as the best monitor technology ever craze? I don't know. I just thought this question was pretty funny. Like, that is just a soft reminder here to everybody who's like, I can run 8 gig. I benchmark fine with my 3070 with 8 gigabytes. Yes, but it has been proven that you are running low textures or lower half the time on a lot of the objects on screen. And what you're saying is you don't notice that. So.
And I will say to the CRT is the best crowd, CRT gives me headaches, so I will forever be glad
because of like the weird humming that goes on.
Yeah, because I finally connected and I looked this up. It's a thing. Yeah, some people get headaches from CRT monitors. And it's like, oh, I wonder why I had constant headaches when I was between the ages of 6 and 14.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's a reason we went to it. There were a lot of benefits besides. I don't want to get into that debate again. I couldn't believe we were even talking about that for a few months. And I know now there will be a bunch of angry people in the comments, but okay, man, game on your CRT.
Write in a correction telling me I'm a conspiracy theorist for believing that CRTs give me headaches.
Go ahead.
I don't get headaches anymore. Still get migraines, but don't get headaches.
Yeah. But all right, moving on to story number 4. Nvidia accused of acting like a cartel. Quoting here from Tom's Hardware, a report published by the Wall Street Journal on Monday surfaces an accusation that Nvidia might be willing to delay data center GPU orders if it becomes aware of a customer looking for greener pastures. Thus, rival AI chipmaker Grog says that fearful customers are still secretive about acquiring or designing AI acceleration technology for fears of retaliation and shipment delays from Nvidia. This stands in contrast to Nvidia's own statements on the matter, with the company saying that it is trying to allocate supply fairly and to offer customers alternative access to compute while they wait for their shipments. And this is also interesting because Scott Herkelman via Twitter tweeted regarding this story and said, "This happens more than you expect. NVIDIA does this with data center customers, OEMs, AIB press, and resellers all the time. They learn from the GeForce Partner Program to just not put it into writing anymore. They didn't stop doing stuff like this. They just don't ship after a customer is ordered. They are the GPU cartel and they control all supply." So even if this is a sort of thing we've reported before on NVIDIA numerous times, like at first when I saw these reports, I went, yep, we've been saying that forever. It is notable that Scott, who isn't just an ex-AMD employee, he is an ex-NVIDIA employee who would know from firsthand experience and would be jeopardizing some future work prospects by saying this, was willing to openly state it. By the way, here's a few examples. There have been allegations that AWS was getting screwed due to their in-house AI chips, Trainium, and AWS is the biggest hyperscaler, and yet there's a lot of allegations that NVIDIA's been messing with them. Or look at NVIDIA DGX Cloud, where NVIDIA sells GPU time using infrastructure of other companies. This was launched with Oracle, who is a small cloud provider. Why go with them? Could it be because NVIDIA knew if they went with Oracle, they would have easy leverage over them in the relationship? Bundling, preferential treatment, exploiting, and leveraging. Is it immoral? Maybe. Is this illegal? Probably not. Even if not, proving illegality would be a very difficult and long court battle. So yeah, the only way to stop NVIDIA's behavior is competition in AI, and that's why a lot of the industry is salivating over MI300, and why leading AI houses are investing hard in ROCm ports, which is what I've heard, by the way, with MI300. A lot of people are going, basically, yeah, it's not always better than Hopper, but at the end of the day, it is better a lot of the time, and it's not NVIDIA. So we're just going to buy MI300 to try to make there be competition in AI, because it's getting desperate with NVIDIA sometimes.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why you need some level of competition in any industry. And while NVIDIA doesn't have a monopoly in AI, they kind of do. And I'm not even saying like from an anti-consumer practice, because they just got there first is why they have the monopoly. Mm-hmm. They do kind of have.
In some parts of the AI business, they kind of have a monopoly right now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why companies like AMD need to catch up. Microsoft is starting to develop their own stuff. And I'm sure there are a million startups or smaller companies that we don't talk about that are also working on AI. But yeah, I mean, that's why competition is necessary, because I don't know. Well, this is like, I don't understand the law well enough to say, I'm not a lawyer. It sounds shady, but it doesn't sound quite illegal to me. Like, yeah, we can ship out things in the order we want them to, and they have the freedom to do that because, well, who else are you going to buy 8100 from?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and I'm trying to remember.
That's what
I don't know if I remember which OEM it was, but I guess I probably wouldn't say, because I don't remember how inside the information was. But like, there were allegations that emerged of that, like a year ago or something, that like NVIDIA was going around and telling OEMs, don't use Intel Alchemist, and if you do, we'll pull allocation. Like, this is something they've been accused of a dozen times for dozens of different products. And I mean, luckily for NVIDIA, they didn't need to threaten them, it turns out, to not use Alchemist. But they did this to Intel too. No, that they do this all the time. This is not really news to me. I do think it's notable that Scott Herkelman and Tom's Hardware and so like a lot of people are publicly saying these things now.
Yeah.
Grand Demand writes in and says, is NVIDIA still producing GA107 or any other desktop mobile Ampere GPU dies, or are their newest Ampere releases like the 3056 gigabytes still using oversupply? It's interesting you asked that, Grand Demand, because recently I actually had one of my contacts at a retailer say they just got in an insane shipment of Ampere cards again. So I don't know how they're doing it, but whatever people say that it's gone, they still have at least a ton of 107 and 106. And my understanding is it's just stuff they made. Again, I need to say this again. I believe, when was this? 2022? I think it was like 2022. I had a video out that did very well, called like the NVIDIA Ampere oversupply leak. And I mean, I think one of the quotes, if I remember right, was that Nvidia made like an entire generation extra of Ampere and then bought more allocation for Lovelace. So like, think about that, everybody. Then they go, well, they bought an entire generation's extra, so that means it should be done by Lovelace. No, you're not listening. They bought enough for Ampere. That's one generation. And then they also bought another entire generation, so 2-3 years worth of cards on top of it. That means if Lovelace never came out, they would have enough cards to sell without Lovelace for years. And then on top of that, they bought up more allocation for Lovelace than at least they needed. So when they say, is there Ampere, I don't think they need to make, do I think they might occasionally make 3060s and 3050s in the future because it's on such a cheap node? Maybe, but I believe everything they're selling right now is oversupply. Again, they made an extra generation's worth. We're not to Blackwell yet. Once we're to Blackwell, maybe we'll be through it. But even then, that would be if you don't even account for having to sell Lovelace. It'd probably take 3-4 years to get rid of all of it, guys.
It seems like they've really overbet. Or I guess that was what I was going to ask is, was part of why they bought so much Ampere the fact that Samsung was giving them a discount on it? Or was that mainly
it was just the mining boom. The mining, then AI, and is the mining boom, they probably thought AI could be popular soon too. And yeah, they got a sweetheart deal. And I don't think there's that many other people using 8 nanometer at Samsung. So they just bought it up. And we are where we are. But again, remember, even if they sold enough for an entire generation or more, that generation ended in 2022. So now add another 2 years to get to now, and then add that they were also selling Lovelace at the same time. And I would expect, they still don't need to make any more Ampere till like 2026 if they wanted to make 3060s or something, So, all right. Let us finally get off of the NVIDIA related news, as it seems like that's been about half of the episode now, and move on to some more Intel stuff with story number 5. Arrow Lake and Lunar Lake updates provided by Moore's Law's Deb. So there have been many random rumors appearing online regarding both Arrow Lake and Lunar Lake recently. And in response to this, yours truly put together a summary of what my sources can currently confirm about these upcoming products, which is Arrow Lake is still expected to be 25 to 35% higher performance over Meteor Lake at same core counts, and likely therefore beat Zen 5 non-X3D in many applications, including probably games. However, that does not account for Zen 5C and X3D variants being firmly beaten. And well, it sounds like if it turns out very well, Arrow Lake might even firmly beat Zen 5 X3D. We're not sure about that yet, but that, in other words, the over-under is, in a worst case Zen 5, best case Arrow Lake, you could see a pretty big win here, possibly. But it doesn't sound like Zen 5 X3D will be like in like 2 performance tiers behind, even in that worst case scenario. Meanwhile, there will be 8 Xe cores of Alchemist Plus for Arrow Lake, at least in mobile, which includes better AI and ray tracing than the Xe cores in Meteor Lake. And then Battle Mage, though, that will go into Lunar Lake with 8 Xe cores, with the goal for Lunar Lake being to have the same or higher performance at half the power compared to Meteor Lake. Higher is possible. I've seen some suggestions of like a really powerful variant of the GPU, but at least right now, based on the roadmaps and presentations some people I talked to recently have seen, it seems like the overall goal is just getting around, and of course in some stuff like single thread, I'm sure a lot better, full Meteor Lake performance, but at like 10 to 15 watts, which remember, Meteor Lake's a 40 watt chip, so that's still an impressive achievement if they get there, but it's not like, again, don't look at Lunar Lake on a roadmap and go, this is for the gamers. And the disappointing thing, though, is the NPU in Arrow Lake is expected to be 10 to 13 tops, soundly beating Meteor Lake, and finally getting on par with Phoenix, meaning that it should be thrashed by Strix, Arrow Lake's AI engine. And it is likely because it uses the same SoC tile, at least at first. Remember, maybe they can swap out to a better tile next year at some point, but at least sounds like at first the SoC tile might be the same between Meteor Lake and Arrow Lake, which would have been the entire point of the tile idea, right? So meanwhile, Lunar Lake should achieve above 40 tops and thus get around Windows 12 AI requirements, but still probably lag behind Strix a little bit in AI performance. Oh, and Arrow Lake is said to launch late 2024. It might just be a paper launch to desktop with Mobile following in early 2025, which has already been leaked, but saying it again, that still is on roadmaps. And Lunar Lake may also get launched in Q4 as well if its Battle Mage tile is working. So there you go. Arrow Lake will have its work cut out for it when it launches this late, and the poor NPU and possibly no NPU on desktop, according to other people's rumors, are vulnerabilities and missed opportunities. Meanwhile, Lunar Lake looks great. It's a niche product, to be clear, but it does look like it might be great. So Dan, what did you think about this information I just put out here?
I mean, to me, Lunar Lake looks like it will be, I don't know, maybe a better iteration on like a better than its time version of like Tiger Lake or something. So I don't know.
Tiger Lake the quad core better GPU version of Tiger Lake. Yeah.
So Lunar Lake seems good. Arrow Lake seems, once again, we've talked about this so many times at this point, but Arrow Lake seems, if it hits all those performance goals, it seems like it will be decent, but I still think the thing that they need to get past is the power issue. Because if they're not past the power usage issue with Arrow Lake, then I kind of think Arrow Lake's dead on arrival, unless it like soundly is beating Zen 5. And I shouldn't just say Zen 5. Soundly beating Zen 5 X3D. Because I would guess Zen 5 X3D is going to be their counter to Arrow Lake.
Well, and it does sound like because Zen 5... well, you know what? Actually, let's just do this right now. We'll make this one big conversation. Let's move on to story number 6. AMD may be preparing a Zen 5 launch across all segments simultaneously in Q3 of 2024. Also, in that Arrow Lake video, I leaked from another source that was not part of the other Zen 5 leaks that AMD is planning to have EPYC chips ready to go up to 192 cores, up to 500 watt TDPs is what this person said, in September. That means that in September, Zen 5C is clearly ready.
Yep.
And they just said EPYC, so it seems like it'll all be ready then. Remember, this also plays into what I've heard in shonen roadmaps that Strix will be ready, probably Q3. And so all of this points to EPYC, AM5 desktop, and mobility of variants of Zen 5 maybe all getting announced in a few months, Dan, and all launching in Q3, which would be at least a full quarter before even desktop Arrow Lake launches, and possibly basically half a year before mobile Arrow Lake launches. And so, yeah, it looks set to compete well against Arrow Lake and Lunar Lake because of this. It will be on a cheaper node. It uses 4 nanometer for a lot of the consumer stuff, not 3 nanometer. So think about that. If they manage to be even around Arrow Lake performance, they're launching sooner with a cheaper node. And that's why Arrow Lake needs to have efficiency and performance supremacy to really make any sense, in my opinion. It's competing against a cheaper product that launched first.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Zen 5 sounds good. It will have a full quarter competing. It will have a full quarter before Arrow Lake even comes out. A bunch of people will buy it, and then AMD will announce X3D at the same time as Arrow Lake comes out, or around the same time that Arrow Lake comes out. And that will give you another, who knows, like, depending on the game, 5 to 20% performance uplift. So Arrow Lake, even if it ends up beating X3D by 5 to 10%, it just needs to be not necessarily as efficient as whatever Zen is, but a lot closer to Zen 5's power efficiency than what Intel has had for the past several years.
Because, yeah, I just want to put this, like, idea of like a potential scenario out there, like one that's not the best or worst case, but maybe even some people would think, depending on how you frame it, an optimistic case for Arrow Lake. Let's say Arrow Lake comes out, like let's say AMD doesn't hold back and maybe they don't launch Zen 5C right away, but they at least launch X3D in the initial lineup, meaning that let's say they just get to like a flat 20% boost, maybe even 20. It depends. It'll depend on the game. Some games I'm sure will be more, but let's say it's a 20% boost over Zen 4 X3D. So the 8800 X3D comes out and it's like $400, 20% better again. And AMD already has like a 5% lead or something, or much more in some games, of course. All right. That's been out in, let's say it comes out in August on AM5. So it's been, what do we go to here? September, October, November, at least 3 months. So we're looking at like a full quarter at least. Like, let's say Arrow Lake is in a December launch. Let's say it's even November. We're looking at a full quarter later. There's been 3 months of this thing that is 25% better than anything Intel has on the market comes out, and it's 35% better. So it wins by 10% in gaming. Okay. And if it uses 300 watts, everyone's going to go, or I can just get this chip that goes into AM5. The platform's cheaper. I know it'll be supported at least through Zen 6. I won't need to buy an expensive cooler. And what's 10%? That is what Intel needs to watch out for.
Yeah. Because you have to remember that when people say a 10% win in performance, what you're really talking about is a 10% theoretical performance uplift that doesn't actually exist in most contexts.
Right. And there will be some games that extra benefit from Vcache where AMD will be able to go, look, we won by 20% in that one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I think, again, Arrow Lake has its work cut out for it. I think even if they got a firm 15% performance win, let's say, in gaming over Zen 5 X3D, they also need to have about the same power consumption. Because if they do them, that's the minimum, I think, for people to go, okay, well, it costs a little more, but it is stronger. The platform's a little better. I'll pay the extra money for probably the i7 to get to that level of performance, the extra money for the new platform that had to be shipped via air with expensive shipping. You know it all. Yeah. And then I don't need to buy an expensive cooler. That is what it will take. Because if any one of those things is more in AMD's favor, I just think everyone's going to go, who cares about that much performance? Everything else is worse anyways or something.
Yeah.
So Dan, I want to ask you this directly then. Nutscracked writes in and says, I wager the AM4 10-year anniversary edition of the 5950X3D. So he's saying, there's a lot of people that think AMD should do an AM4 anniversary release of an even better Zen 3 X3D chip. I don't think that's going to happen, but he wagers this. So let's say he wagers $700 that Arrow Lake will be dead on arrival. I just want to take this in to go, I'll give my opinion next. Gut feeling, Dan, how do you think Arrow Lake's just going to do against Zen 5? This isn't a leak. This is your gut feeling.
Yeah, I mean, my gut feeling is that it's going to underperform versus Zen 5, but that's just that's more informed by the fact that that's just what they've been doing for the past several generations. And I don't see that big of a reason why I should expect this one to be any different. But
for me, I will say gut feeling, not a leak. This part isn't leak. This is just what I'm imagining. Intel knows this has to deliver. I think what's going to happen is probably Arrow Lake launches. It uses a lot less energy than people expected. Like, I'm not even going to quantify it exactly. It's just, it is a lot better than people expected. They're basically getting 2 node shrinks here. So I'm going to argue they do have power. I'm going to guess, my gut, their power consumption will be somewhat under control at least. And they will beat AMD or at least trade blows. And they will have a couple of features and some types of games that run really, really well. But this is the thing that would make me wonder. I wonder if it launches, though, and I have my gut is that it will launch, but I do think it's by the time that it launches, it will feel late, and that by the time it hits laptop, people are going to have Strix and a bunch of things anyway. So my gut feeling is its power consumption is going to be better than expected, and its performance is going to be good. But actually, I think there will be 2 camps of people when they look at reviews. The people that expect Intel to always suck, that will be pleasantly surprised. Maybe that will be you, Dan. And then there's going to be another group of people that bought into the like 50% IPC increase rumors and say it's not good. And it's going to be there's going to be a lot of weird opinions that some people will be surprised by, but it's because there's such low expectations now in some circles that I think some people will expect anything that's competitive, see it and go, whoa, kind of like with Meteor Lake, frankly. And then there will be some people that go, this sucks. This isn't a 50% IPC increase. And then completely ignore the fact that Intel seems to have cut power in half in a generation, which would be tremendous and lead to better things in the future. Yeah. You know, but it all comes down to, will it actually launch this year? That's for me actually where I'm at. I think it's going to be good. I think that's where we need to worry.
Yeah.
Bfish36 writes in and says, with 1440p and 4K becoming more common, how much does the CPU gaming crown really matter when most scenarios will be GPU limited? Also, even if Arrow Lake is better for gaming, if it's more expensive and on a dead platform with no upgrade path, well, it won't be a dead platform when it comes out, I don't think. But how much will that hurt sales versus AMD? I think Pat needs to go out there. We talked about this in a recent die shrink. Pat needs to come out and go, we knew that consumers wanted more generations, so we had 3 all the way up to 14th gen from 12th on LGA 1700, and we promised to do that or better this time around. That's what he needs to say that firmly, because otherwise I think a lot of people would save money and use the platform that can maybe use Zen 7 than risk Intel doing this again.
Yeah, and I mean, we also talked about that before, just for the CPU gaming crown. I generally don't think it's all that relevant. If you're within like 15% of the gaming crown for most hardware reviews, I think you functionally have the best CPU on the market. And the reason I would recommend like something like the 7800 X3D so much isn't necessarily that it has the gaming crown. It's that it has the gaming crown, and it's also in the middle range for CPU pricing.
Exactly, without requiring expensive cooling. So it matters near the mid-range, I think. The problem with Intel, and the reason they're losing sales so much, is they want you to buy a refrigerator to cool it, and it's $600.
Yeah, so if the, what would it be? The 15900K comes out, and it's...
well, it might be Series 2 Core 9 Ultra, by the way. Series 2.
Okay. If their top chip is $750 and like 20% better than the 7800 X3D.
9800 X3D, actually. I've been saying 9800 X3D.
Yeah, it would be like, all right. I mean, that might still be not the one to go for if it's $400. If the alternative is $400, because it'll be 20% better at 1080p. Which, if you're buying one of these CPUs, I don't think you're gaming in 1080p anyways, unless you're an esports person. Then, I don't know, my advice isn't for you.
And I can't point out the cost thing enough. Right now, AMD is selling the 7900 XT for like $700 or something on Newegg. That has 300 millimeters squared of 5 nanometer silicon. 4 nanometer is in the same family. It's only like 5% better or something. Like, think about this, everybody. They are selling 300 millimeters squared of 5 nanometer silicon, and then an additional, what is it, like 180 or something, 200 millimeters squared or something of 6 nanometer silicon for the memory dies for a 7900 XT. They're selling that for $70, and they have the packaging cost of chiplets. They're selling that for $700. Zen 5 will be using like half the silicon. Do you not think they could and it doesn't have to come with a cooler. Do you not think they might be able to sell that for $350 if they really had to someday? They probably could if they had to, if they're willing to sell the 7900 XT for that much. Meanwhile, Intel is using more expensive packaging than either of those probably, and more expensive nodes. So I just think when we talk about, like, Arrow Lake does need to win by 10%, frankly 20%, for it to be a knockout blow. The reason we're saying that is AMD, if they use Zen 5C, they can do 8 X3D plus 16 5C. They can probably take the multi-threading crown firmly from Intel and then go, yeah, I know, they won gaming performance even in the top end by, let's say, 10, 20%. Well, we have a $600 chip that wins multi-threading by 20% and uses, and it works in AM5. And actually in these games, it wins by 20%. That is why it needs to be a knockout blow, because if Intel only manages to beat X3D by 5% in the top end, all of the AMD's mid-range chips will be better at gaming, and anyone paying for multi-threading will be able to probably get a 9960 X3D, is I guess what it would probably be called. They'll be able to get that probably for $100 less. It'll be about the same gaming performance. Then it'll win multi-threading. That's why Intel needs a big win here.
Yeah, because until games start moving past that 8-core limit that games just seem to have, just having more cores really isn't going to benefit you that much. So,
and they're removing hyper-threading, so whatever, they can add Zen 5C cores and win that against Intel anyways.
So yeah, like having an 8-core X3D CPU is always going to be the best for gaming I think for the foreseeable future. But
all righty, let's move on then to story number 7. Coral Rapids leaked to be coming after Diamond Rapids on 14A. Just mentioning that in that same video we've been talking about for a while here. Also, Coral Rapids was leaked as the successor to Diamond Rapids by this channel. It's an exclusive leak of the next thing coming to data center, and it does utilize the 14A node for the core compute models. I don't know how much you have to discuss about this, though.
Not really anything. Just glad 14A sounds like it's moving along.
You know, the one thing I will bring up about
progression in general is moving.
You know, it's funny. I don't think I have the links to it, but I believe Samsung just renamed their 3-nanometer node as 2-nanometer.
Well, good for them.
And I sent that to an Nvidia contact of mine who really has bad memories of working with Samsung. And the person said, yep, they probably did that in response to Intel saying 14A. And then the person goes, can't wait to see if TSMC calls their next node 1-nanometer for fun. I mean, at this point, why not?
Yeah, I know.
Alrighty. Well, let us then move on from this 1 or 2 minute conversation for the final story to the wrap up. These are, of course, these stories that did not get their own full discussion, if you can call that last one full, I suppose. But we did think they were worth talking about. So the first one here was I thought this was another interesting pro-consumer worthy test done by Igor's labs that found that half of the radiators and just components in general and all-in-one liquid coolers are not using the components they say they are. Now, he stopped just short of saying that this was always intentional, that maybe they just had really bad quality control. And he's not talking about performance. He's not saying that because one of them uses the components it claims to, it's better than another one. He is just saying you're not getting what they say you are, and that at a minimum is bad.
Well, but a lot of these do seem pretty bad to me because like a lot of them are using brass instead of copper for their radiators, and
I'm saying that's what he seemed to say. I'm not saying it's not bad.
But it just to me, like, if I remember correctly, copper is one of the best thermal conductors in existence. Like, I think it's like that and gold are the best thermal conductors. So if they're telling you they're selling you copper and they're not selling you copper, that is very bad.
And whether or not theirs is better than the competition, it would be even better if they actually gave you what you were paying for.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's and I want to be clear. I think the reason Igor did that, if I understood correctly, is it's just like, well, let's not make that accusation yet that it's intentional because we can't prove it. You know, and Igor operates like a true journalist where he doesn't want to say something unless he can prove it or he's sure. He just wants to allege what he can basically prove. But yeah, on that note, though, he's like, well, but so if their next generation doesn't fix the issue, then we know it's intentional.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can write the article, they're intentionally lying to you. Just FYI, another great article out of Igor that I thought you guys should check out. Nvidia basically seems to have killed ZLUDA right when everyone was getting hyped about it. There's actually maybe going to be, before more news dropped, that a main story was going to be maybe that AMD has emulated CUDA.
Mm-hmm.
And now it seems like Nvidia just put out some stuff that will kill it again long term. So that's cool.
Whew.
But yeah, also there's a note here from Carbon Cry that says, well, ZLUDA is already kind of dead, partially because of this, partially because of other things, but also there's a lot of AI companies divesting from CUDA right now, just because whether it can be translated or not, they're tired of this being something that affects business decisions. So yeah. I will say that is, don't take this to mean that AI can't get into AMD can't get into AI. Just take this to mean that something that could have been cool probably won't pan out. All right, Sam, because I actually think the consumer side is what would benefit most. Like if you're using an app that has a lazily written hardware acceleration feature, maybe your AMD GPU could just use that. Mm-hmm. Like that's who I think suffers the most from this in the short term. Long term, it might not change that much. And then, yeah, one of the links in here is Samsung renames their fake 3 nanometer node to a fake 2 nanometer node. So, again, just notably bringing that up because I think that's hilarious.
Oh, good for them.
Good for you, Samsung. I mean, I just want to say this again. When I asked one of my NVIDIA contacts, like, what proposals there were for different nodes, I think there were a couple TSMC node proposals and maybe a couple 8 nanometer. This is one they went with on 8 nanometer that we talked about with the Switch 2. When I asked, what about a newer Samsung node, they were like, you mean the dumpster fires? So I just want to point that out. Like, that is how people think about Samsung Foundries right now in the truly advanced department. All right, Final Raider Mails here. Nuts Cracked writes in again and says, will our God King Jensen Huang be buying Intel Foundries for his own x86 license for CPU production by 2030? He'll have to do it before he retires, right? Well, this is a long-term aspiration, I've always been told, of Jensen Huang to compete directly in gaming CPUs. And I was talking to a contact of mine, maybe this will make it into a leak coming up soon, about how there are some people behind the scenes that are suspecting Intel may sell off some of its foundries. Not all of them, but they may spin off a lot of their older ones. And when we were talking about, well, who would want these? It was like, maybe Tesla for self-driving chips. I guess maybe Nvidia for self-driving chips and stuff. But then you go, oh, but what if Nvidia would overpay for one of these foundries and Intel needs a ton of money right now? And they'd say, because people don't know this, AMD has one x86 license, and Intel's bought up, like, I believe Cyrix, if I'm remembering Cyrix or something, and maybe VIA at this point. But that means Intel holds multiple x86 licenses. So arguably Intel could sell one and keep one. And if Nvidia did that and way overpaid for Intel's foundries to make Pat look good, but also and give them the money they need, but then get x86. Throwing that out there. I'm not saying that will happen, but it is, you joke, but it's like,
maybe.
I don't know. Like, I am sure they've thought about if that's possible over there. Okay. And I like this. All right. So final question here comes from QH Freddy, who says, in a lot of Payroon's military analysis videos, he mentions a lot of platforms and technologies promising to be game changers on the battlefield that end up over-promising and under-delivering. How applicable do you think that is to semiconductors and PC hardware? What do you think is the most egregious case of it? Yeah, I think it is. Like, this is an interesting reference. Like, this has been something where people analyze a lot of wars, including, of course, the one in Ukraine right now, where they're like, well, this new thing will change the entire battlefield. And it's like, no, not unless literally every soldier just now is flying an F-16 or something. It's like, you could argue maybe like HIMARS was a game changer, but this is the thing you see a lot in wars. You could go back and read news clippings from World War II. Every new weapon used by either side was, is this a game changer? And ultimately Germany ran out of people. That's what happened. So, like, I think this is a thing that we see in PC hardware a lot too.
Oh yeah, when you're doing in research and development, you always, just as somebody that's spent a lot of time working in research, you always think that you're going to get to the goal that you want twice as fast as you're going to get to it. And that's a huge source of pessimism for a lot of people, because you write your timeline down and you're like, this is when we're going to get something done. And you haven't built in anything for all of the errors that are going to take place, all of the things that are going to fail. So at the end of the day, you come out and it takes twice as long to get whatever you are making out there.
Yeah. And, actually, my initial answer to this is an example. I want to hear what yours are. My initial one was crazy coolers, because how often do we see this mass-produced, almost exotic, like beyond liquid cooler is going to be a game changer for cooling, and we just still don't really see them. I think we will get more advanced coolers soon, and there are some Peltier ones out there, I believe, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of them being mass produced at a reasonable price to anyone. So that's one that's always announced, but actually I'm just now realizing, for me, the best answer is batteries. God dang it, every freaking month,
every year they're guys, we reinvented chemistry. Batteries are about to be way better.
Batteries to become 1,000 times higher capacity at half the weight in 2 years. Nope, that has never happened. They've gotten 10% better every year, and it's starting to add up.
Yeah,
that's the truth, basically. And, and how many of those battery things they discover use like a different mineral or something that isn't, there's like no supply chain to mine it, package it, and manufacture it with factories. That's 10 years away.
Well, if we just could have this element that doesn't exist on Earth, our batteries would be so much better.
Yep, but we do not. So, yeah, like we have an asteroid that had this one element that's super rare. And yes, we were able to replicate it. This isn't like, I don't know if this is actually an example, but like all the time they do these things where they prove you can make a battery that does this. And it's like, right. So then wake me up when you have the supply chain built, the places where you're going to mine the minerals, sourced, everything and all permits done, and you're ready to mass manufacture it. And you understand its failure points. I mean, OLED didn't really get good until 6 years after it came out. I mean, then you have to go through that phase. So for me, that's the biggest one. This is going to be that game changer. That for me is probably the most egregious one I see constantly.
Yeah. If only we could build a battery out of francium, Tom.
Francium. It'd certainly be fun. Be a lot of French flags on
and it would
on
be
news
fun.
Stories.
It would be fun because they blow up if they come into contact with water.
So what? We'll figure it out. That'd be great for smartphones where we need higher capacities the most. God. Yeah. Can you imagine how many AI generated thumbnails though we would see on clickbait news websites where they AI generate francium battery and it's just French flags everywhere? That's what I want to see. I want to see that.
Hell yeah, baby.
When it would probably have just been easier to like Photoshop a French flag onto the battery than use AI to generate this nonsense image.
Who can tell? No one knows.
Who can tell? We just need more Cronenberg versions of CPUs in every thumbnail on Forbes or something.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we will end the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure you hit the like button. Please make sure you talk about this if you're at all interested in what we discussed and have your own thoughts in the comments. That helps the algorithm a lot. And also share it and join the and make sure you're subscribed to Moore's Law is Dead on YouTube. We've been growing a lot this year. Actually, as of recording, we just hit 175,000 subscribers. We're actually growing faster than late last year. So let's keep the momentum going. It says most of the times I check, it says half of you haven't subscribed, which when I look at some of the views for these videos means, so what? There's 90,000 subscribers just on the table here. If you are one of them, please subscribe. This really does help us a lot as well. And of course, also consider joining the Moore's Law is Dead Patreon, where you'll get access to Diashock episodes. One just came out, a great complimentary 1-hour video looking at LGA 1851 out of Intel. It's just there, no ads. There's hundreds of other pieces of content. Listen to the episode that made someone at Nvidia message me and get a Switch 2 leak out. There's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes on the Moore's Law is Dead Patreon. For just $2 a month, get you access to all that content. And higher tiers get you far, far more. The most popular one is actually the $4 tier. But otherwise, I'm tired. I'm rambling. And I hope you have a good week, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie No Sugada as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page. In the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carrie No Sugada as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans,
much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels:
Brad Medlin, Drita Foles, Z Chits, Daniel D, Aaron Close, Jan Renner, Daniel Hyde, GZ Ziggy, Brian Riggleman, MJB1, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, SNES Chalmers, Jerome Ferrier, Valcom Alev, Jensen Wang, HardForum.com, Gregory Sacker, Andrew S, Sarcastro, Evan Dingle, Chris Rich, Chris Press, Earthplex, 3DS Boy 08, Halbuma, Greg Wanchek, Shredberg, Dr. Foreman, Benjamin Cannon, Jonathan, Olden Mobley, Blake, Franco Frederic, Sammy Malas, Jake223, Jake Martin, Jordan Simkovic, Slicky, Julian Leak, The Boz Haas, Stefan Hart, Mina Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Stefan, Toka, Mad, Zutsu Taylor, Stefan Coates, Michael McGee, Greg, Patrick Crow, Amiable Chief, Chrysantine, Tommy, Mark Mitchell, Aisha, Mark Raidmaker, The Eternal Dreamers, James Anderson, Cole Addict, Judson N, Neithra Zink, Cameron, Wesley Sager, Henry Zhang, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Hexapuma, Reginald Ari, T. Cottom, Gaiman Since Reagan, Jeff Sedler, Loophole 35, JSMH, Windstar, James I. Raider, Corey Leonard, Little Germany, Shay, Milton, Pulse Media, Jamie Witters, Dave Schultz, Melodic Warrior, Mac Daffy, Stephen Dick, Chuck Glidden, Brett Jones, Austin Haggerty, Justin Bussell, I-701-700K, Joe Foot, Hardland, Earth Taurus, Slushpod, Jason Angima, Joseph Kelly, Samuel Park, Himsa Gung, Tails2299, Meal Val, Verga, John, Sisyphos, Dale Russell, The Forbidden Juice, Leakedman, Winwing, RB Racer, AC, Michael Cozy, Dr. J Mad, Alex Vega, Free D, Brian Wright, John Swin, Angel of Cake, Jola Martina, Keekum, Albergun, Stellarized 80, Matthew Marlowe, Raisin Biscuit, Jeff Johnson, Penta Winta, Rowan McHickey, Cornstir 671, Sprutnik, Jeffrey Linneman, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.